My wife's mother said I wasn't good enough. She lost access to her grandchildren instead. Eleanor Whitmore told me to my face at our wedding reception that her daughter was marrying beneath her station. I was a high school teacher making $52,000 a year. Isabel was a marketing director at a pharmaceutical company making triple that. Eleanor stood next to the champagne fountain in her $3,000 dress and said teachers were noble but poor, and did I really think I could provide the lifestyle her daughter deserved? I told her Isabel and I loved each other, and that's what mattered. She smiled in that way wealthy people do when they think you're adorable and stupid. She said love doesn't pay mortgages or country club memberships. Then she walked away to talk to someone more important. Isabel hadn't heard the conversation because she was dancing with her father. I didn't tell her about it that night because it was our wedding day. I didn't tell her for 3 years because I thought Eleanor would eventually accept me. I was wrong about that. Eleanor had other plans. She started small with comments about my car being old or my clothes being off the rack. She'd mention how Isabel's ex-boyfriend David was now a partner at a law firm downtown making mid-six figures. She'd ask when I was planning to get my administrative credentials so I could at least be a principal and make decent money. Isabel would tell her to stop, but Eleanor always had an excuse ready. She was just making conversation or showing interest in my career or wanting the best for us. The comments never stopped. They just evolved. When Isabel got pregnant with our first child, Eleanor's interference shifted into overdrive. She insisted on paying for the nursery furniture because she said we obviously couldn't afford quality pieces on a teacher's salary. She showed up at our apartment with a designer crib that cost $4,000 and said it was non-negotiable because her grandchild deserved the best. Isabel tried to refuse, but Eleanor started crying about how she just wanted to help, and why were we being so proud when clearly we needed assistance. I stood there watching this manipulation happen and said we appreciated the thought, but we'd already ordered furniture. Eleanor asked if I meant the cheap set from Target I'd added to our registry. Her voice had this edge to it that made it clear she thought Target furniture was basically child abuse. Isabel looked exhausted from pregnancy and Eleanor's emotional manipulation. She gave in and accepted the crib. Eleanor hugged her and told her that was smart. Then she looked at me and said, maybe I'd learn to accept help gracefully instead of letting my pride hurt my family. I wanted to throw that $4,000 crib out the window. Instead, I helped carry it upstairs and assembled it in silence while Eleanor supervised and made suggestions. Our daughter Sophie was born on a Friday morning in March. She was perfect. 7 pounds, dark hair, Isabel's eyes. Eleanor arrived at the hospital 3 hours after the birth with enough flowers to open a shop and a photographer she'd hired to capture the moment. She pushed past me into the room and started crying over Sophie while the photographer snapped pictures. I asked Isabel if she'd known about the photographer. She shook her head, looking confused and tired. Eleanor said she wanted professional photos of Sophie's first day because these moments were precious, and obviously we couldn't afford a good photographer ourselves. The photographer spent an hour posing Eleanor with Sophie, while Isabel tried to rest, and I stood in the corner wondering when this became Eleanor's experience instead of ours. When I finally asked the photographer to leave because Isabel needed to sleep, Eleanor said I was being selfish and difficult. She said grandmothers have rights too. That phrase stuck with me. Grandmothers have rights. As if her being related to Sophie meant she got equal say in how we raised our child. As if our home and our family were somehow her property because she'd contributed DNA. The first year of Sophie's life was a constant battle with Eleanor's boundary violations. She'd show up unannounced to our apartment, claiming she was just in the neighborhood and wanted to see her granddaughter. She'd criticize how we dressed Sophie or fed Sophie or scheduled Sophie's naps. She bought clothes without asking us and then got offended when we returned them because they weren't our style or were impractical. She started a college fund for Sophie and told everyone at her country club about it, making sure to mention that Sophie's father couldn't afford to save for her education on a teacher's salary. Isabel confronted her mother twice about the constant criticism and boundary violations. Both times Eleanor cried and said she was just trying to help because clearly we were overwhelmed and struggling. She'd hug Isabel and apologize while somehow making it sound like Isabel was the problem for being so sensitive. Then within a week, Eleanor would be back to the same behavior. I started documenting everything. Every unannounced visit, every critical comment, every manipulation. I didn't know why I was doing it at first. Just instinct that this was building towards something bigger. When Sophie was 18 months old, Isabel got pregnant again. We were happy, but also anxious about doubling the Eleanor problem. The comments got worse. Eleanor asked if we'd considered that another baby would stretch our already tight finances. She suggested maybe I should get a second job, or Isabel should ask for a raise, since clearly one income wasn't enough. She started bringing groceries to our apartment without asking, claiming she noticed our fridge looked empty and she didn't want her granddaughter going hungry. Isabel told her to stop, but Eleanor just kept doing it. She'd arrive with bags of expensive organic food we never asked for, and then mention how expensive everything was and how hard it must be for us to make ends meet. I started refusing to let her in when she showed up unannounced. She'd stand in the hallway and knock louder, sometimes for 10 minutes, until neighbors started looking. Isabel would call me at work crying because her mother was texting her saying I was keeping her away from Sophie. I'd come home and find Eleanor had convinced the building manager to let her in, using some excuse about a family emergency. She'd be sitting on our couch with Sophie when I walked in, acting like she belonged there. Our son Lucas was born in September, another healthy baby. Eleanor was at the hospital within an hour this time, photographer in tow again. I told the photographer to leave immediately, or I'd call security. Eleanor started crying loudly in the hospital hallway about how I was cruel and controlling and trying to keep her from her grandchildren. A nurse came in and asked if everything was okay. Eleanor said through tears that her son-in-law was being unreasonable, and she just wanted photos of her new grandson. The nurse looked at me with that expression that said she thought I was the problem. I explained we hadn't invited a photographer and wanted privacy. Eleanor said she'd paid for the photographer as a gift. The nurse suggested we work it out as a family and left. Eleanor stopped crying immediately once the nurse was gone. She looked at me and said we both knew Isabel would want the photos and I was being stubborn for no reason. I called Isabel's father, Gregory, and told him to come get his wife. He arrived 20 minutes later and convinced Eleanor to leave. As she walked out, she told Isabel she'd be back tomorrow when I was at work, and hopefully Isabel would be more reasonable without me influencing her. I took the next week off work using sick days and personal time, so Eleanor couldn't visit while I was gone. She called Isabel 6 times a day, asking when she could meet Lucas properly. Isabel was exhausted from having a newborn and an 18-month-old. She wanted to make her mother happy, but also wanted the boundary violations to stop. I told her we needed to have a serious conversation with Eleanor about expectations and rules. Isabel agreed, but kept putting it off because confronting her mother was emotionally draining. Eleanor sensed the delay and pushed harder. She started sending gifts to our apartment daily: clothes for Lucas, toys for Sophie, a $600 stroller I found in our building's lobby with a note saying every mother deserves quality equipment. I donated everything to charity. Eleanor found out somehow and called Isabel screaming about how ungrateful and disrespectful I was, how I was obviously threatened by her generosity because I couldn't provide the same quality. Isabel defended me, but I could hear her mother's voice through the phone getting louder and more emotional. The call ended with Eleanor crying and Isabel crying and me feeling helpless. We finally had the confrontation when Lucas was 6 weeks old. Isabel texted her parents asking them to come over for a serious conversation. They arrived together. Gregory looked nervous. Eleanor looked prepared for battle. We sat in our small living room and Isabel laid out the boundaries. No more unannounced visits. No more unwanted gifts. No more comments about our finances or my career. No more trying to override our parenting decisions. Eleanor listened with her arms crossed. When Isabel finished, Eleanor said these rules were ridiculous and insulting. She said she was Sophie and Lucas's grandmother and had every right to see them whenever she wanted. I spoke up and said no, she didn't. She was a guest in our home and in our children's lives. She had privileges, not rights, and those privileges could be revoked if she couldn't respect our boundaries. Eleanor stood up and pointed at me. She said this was all my doing, that I'd turned her daughter against her because I was insecure about my inadequacy as a provider, that Isabel would never treat her this way if I wasn't manipulating her. Gregory tried to calm Eleanor down, but she kept going. She said I was a failure as a husband and probably as a father too. that her daughter had thrown away her future marrying a broke teacher, that Sophie and Lucas would grow up poor and embarrassed because their father couldn't give them the life they deserved. Isabel told her mother to get out. Eleanor looked shocked. She said she was just being honest, and someone needed to say what everyone was thinking. Isabel stood up while holding Lucas and told her mother to leave our apartment immediately. Eleanor started crying and reached for Lucas. Isabel stepped back. Eleanor said she was sorry and didn't mean it, but her eyes weren't sorry. They were angry that we weren't backing down. Gregory led Eleanor toward the door. She turned back and said she wouldn't forget this, that we'd regret keeping her from her grandchildren, that she'd find a way to see them whether we liked it or not. The door closed, and Isabel started shaking. She handed Lucas to me and sat down hard on the couch. I asked if she was okay. She said she'd never heard her mother talk that way before. The mask had finally come off. We decided Eleanor couldn't see the kids until she apologized and agreed to our boundaries. We thought she'd resist for a week, maybe 2, then cave because she'd miss Sophie and Lucas too much. We were wrong about how far Eleanor would go. 3 days later, I came home from work to find Eleanor in our apartment with Sophie. My daughter was crying, and Eleanor was trying to force her into a dress Sophie clearly didn't want to wear. I asked how Eleanor got in. She said the building manager let her in because she was family, and there'd been a package delivery. I checked, and there was no package. Eleanor had lied to get access. I told her to leave immediately. She said she was just visiting her granddaughter and I was overreacting. Sophie ran to me crying, and I picked her up. I called Isabel at work and put her on speaker. Eleanor started crying and saying I was being cruel. Isabel told her mother she needed to leave and she wasn't welcome until she apologized and agreed to boundaries. Eleanor said we couldn't keep her from her grandchildren. Isabel said actually we could, and we were. Eleanor left, but not before saying she'd be calling her lawyer. I changed our building manager and filed a formal complaint with the management company about the unauthorized access. I also started the process of getting a security camera for our front door. Eleanor's lawyer sent us a letter 2 weeks later. It mentioned grandparent visitation rights and claimed we were unreasonably preventing Eleanor from having a relationship with her grandchildren. The letter suggested we enter mediation to establish a formal visitation schedule. I took the letter to a family law attorney. She read it and asked about our situation. I explained everything going back to our wedding day. She said grandparent rights varied by state but generally required proof that denying access would harm the children. She said Eleanor would have an uphill battle proving that, especially since she'd only been restricted for a few weeks and had a history of boundary violations we'd documented. I showed her my documentation of every incident over the past 2 years. She said it was thorough and would be useful if this went to court. She recommended we not respond to the lawyer's letter and wait for Eleanor to file actual court documents if she was serious. She said most grandparent rights cases were expensive and emotionally draining, and many grandparents gave up once they realized the fight was real. Eleanor filed a petition for grandparent visitation 3 weeks later. We were formally served with court papers. The hearing was set for 2 months out. Our attorney filed a response denying Eleanor's claims and attaching our documentation of her behavior. Gregory called me directly for the first time ever. He said Eleanor had convinced him this was necessary because we were completely cutting her off and it wasn't fair. I told him we'd set clear boundaries and Eleanor had violated them immediately by lying to our building manager. He said Eleanor claimed that was a misunderstanding. I said it wasn't. He was quiet for a while. Then he asked what it would take for us to drop this. I said an apology from Eleanor, acceptance of our boundaries, and no contact until we felt comfortable allowing supervised visits. He said Eleanor would never agree to supervised visits. I said then we'd see her in court. He hung up. 2 days later, Eleanor's lawyer filed an emergency motion claiming we were preventing Eleanor from seeing her grandchildren during holidays and it was causing her emotional distress. Our lawyer said it was a common manipulation tactic to make us look unreasonable. The judge denied the emergency motion. The court hearing happened on a cold morning in November. We brought our attorney and our documentation. Eleanor brought her attorney in tears. She testified that she loved her grandchildren desperately and couldn't understand why we'd cut her off. She claimed she'd always been supportive and generous, and we'd turned on her without reason. She cried when describing how much she missed Sophie and Lucas. The judge looked sympathetic. Then our attorney cross-examined her, asked about the wedding reception comment about me being beneath Isabel. Eleanor claimed she didn't remember saying that. Our attorney asked about the unsolicited gifts and the college fund she'd used to publicly criticize my income. Eleanor said those were acts of love. Our attorney asked about lying to the building manager to gain access to our apartment after being told to stay away. Eleanor said that was a misunderstanding. Our attorney presented her texts to Isabel where she'd explicitly said she'd find a way to see the kids whether we liked it or not. Eleanor said that was just emotion speaking. She didn't mean it as a threat. Our attorney asked why she'd hired a photographer to intrude on private family moments without permission twice. Eleanor said she was preserving memories. She started crying harder and said we were twisting everything to make her look bad. Then Isabel testified. She was calm and clear. She explained the pattern of boundary violations, the manipulation, the financial criticism, the unannounced visits, the refusal to respect our parenting decisions. She said she loved her mother, but couldn't allow that behavior around her children. She said her mother had been given multiple chances to change and had instead escalated. She said protecting her children from emotional manipulation was her priority. Eleanor's attorney tried to make Isabel sound ungrateful, asked if her mother had always provided for her growing up. Isabel said yes. Asked if her mother had paid for her education. Isabel said yes. Asked if her mother had offered financial help even as an adult. Isabel said yes, but that didn't give her mother the right to control our family or disrespect my husband. The judge asked Eleanor directly if she'd agreed to the boundaries her daughter had set. Eleanor hesitated, then said some of the boundaries were unreasonable. The judge asked which ones. Eleanor said she shouldn't need permission to visit her grandchildren. The judge said actually she did. The children lived with their parents and the parents had final say over who had access. Eleanor started crying again. I testified last. I explained that I'd tried for years to build a relationship with Eleanor, that I'd tolerated insults and criticism because I didn't want to cause problems in Isabel's family, that I'd documented everything only after it became clear the behavior wasn't stopping. I said my children deserved grandparents who respected their parents and modeled healthy boundaries, that Eleanor had shown she couldn't do that her response to being asked for basic respect was to threaten legal action instead of apologizing. I said I'd love for my children to have a relationship with their grandmother, but not at the cost of their emotional safety or our family's autonomy. Eleanor's attorney asked if I felt threatened by Eleanor's wealth. I said no. I felt threatened by her inability to accept that her daughter had built a life separate from her control. The judge took a recess to review the evidence. We waited outside the courtroom for 90 minutes. When we returned, the judge denied Eleanor's petition. She said grandparent visitation rights exist to prevent harm to children, not to override parental decisions. She said there was no evidence that Sophie or Lucas were being harmed by limited contact with Eleanor. She said Eleanor had multiple opportunities to repair the relationship by respecting boundaries and had chosen legal action instead. She said the petition was denied and Eleanor would have to work with her daughter and son-in-law directly if she wanted access to her grandchildren. Eleanor screamed in the courtroom, actually screamed that this was wrong and the judge was biased and we'd manipulated everything. The bailiff told her to calm down or leave. Eleanor's attorney pulled her into the hallway. We could hear her crying loudly outside. Gregory followed her out, looking exhausted. Our attorney said this was a strong ruling in our favor, that Eleanor would have difficulty filing again without showing changed circumstances. We left through a different exit to avoid another confrontation. In the parking garage, Isabel started crying. Not sad crying, relief crying. She said she'd been terrified the judge would side with her mother, that she'd been preparing herself to have supervised visitations forced on us, that the validation from a judge that we'd been reasonable meant everything. I held her while she cried and felt rage at Eleanor for putting her daughter through this, for making Isabel choose between her mother and her family, for being so selfish that she'd rather go to court than simply apologize and respect boundaries. Eleanor tried calling Isabel 31 times that evening. Isabel blocked her number. Eleanor started calling me. I blocked her too. Eleanor showed up at our apartment building at 8 p.m. The new building manager called me for permission to let her up. I said no. Eleanor waited in the lobby for 2 hours. The manager finally asked her to leave or he'd call police. She left. Gregory called the next morning. He said Eleanor was devastated and not handling the court ruling well. He said she felt humiliated and angry. I said she'd humiliated herself by refusing to respect boundaries. He said he agreed with me privately, but couldn't say that to Eleanor. He asked if there was any path forward. I said yes. Eleanor could send a written apology acknowledging her behavior and accepting our boundaries. Then after some time, we'd consider supervised visits. He said Eleanor would never do that. She believed she was right and we were wrong. I said then there was no path forward. He sighed and said he was sorry it had come to this. I asked if he'd known about her plan to take us to court before she filed. He said yes. I asked why he didn't try to stop her. He said he'd been trying to keep peace with Eleanor for 35 years and it had never worked. He was tired. I felt bad for Gregory. He'd married a woman who'd slowly revealed herself to be controlling and unable to accept boundaries, and he'd spent decades managing her behavior instead of confronting it. The months after the court hearing were quiet. No calls from Eleanor, no letters from her attorney, no surprise visits. Isabel struggled with the loss of her mother. She'd been prepared for anger but not complete silence. She'd hoped the court ruling would force Eleanor to reflect and change. Instead, Eleanor had apparently decided that if she couldn't have access on her terms, she'd have no access at all. Isabel called Gregory once a month to check in. He'd give brief updates. Eleanor was angry. Eleanor was hurt. Eleanor was talking to her therapist. That last one was new. Apparently, Eleanor had started therapy at Gregory's insistence. He said he'd told her that if she wanted any chance of seeing her grandchildren again, she needed to work on her issues with control and boundaries. Eleanor had agreed, but Gregory said he wasn't optimistic about actual change. He said she spent her therapy sessions complaining about how unfairly she'd been treated rather than examining her own behavior. I told Isabel this, and she looked sad, but not surprised. She said her mother had always been good at playing the victim. Sophie turned 3 that March. We had a small party at our apartment with a few of her friends from daycare. She was obsessed with dinosaurs and wanted a T-Rex cake. I made it myself and it looked terrible, but she loved it. Lucas was almost 2, walking and getting into everything. Our apartment felt too small for our growing family, but we were saving for a house and couldn't afford anything bigger yet. Eleanor sent a present through the mail, a $300 toy kitchen set for Sophie. No card, no note, just the gift. Isabel called her father and asked if this was from her mother. He confirmed. Isabel asked if Eleanor wanted a thank you call. He said no. Eleanor just wanted Sophie to have something special for her birthday. Isabel asked if this meant her mother was ready to apologize and follow boundaries. Gregory said no. Eleanor still believed she was right. This was just her trying to stay connected in the only way she could. Isabel sent the kitchen set back with a note saying we couldn't accept gifts until Eleanor was ready to apologize and be part of our lives properly. Eleanor called Gregory crying after receiving the returned gift. He told Isabel that Eleanor felt rejected and hurt. Isabel said good. Maybe being hurt would motivate her to actually reflect on her behavior. A year passed. Then 18 months. Sophie started pre-K. Lucas was talking in full sentences. We'd saved enough for a down payment and were house hunting in neighborhoods with good public schools. Eleanor had been completely silent except for gifts sent through the mail that we returned every time. Gregory reported that Eleanor had stopped going to therapy after 8 months. She'd decided the therapist was biased against her. He said she talked about Sophie and Lucas constantly, but refused to acknowledge that her behavior had been wrong. She'd constructed a narrative where we were cruel and ungrateful, and keeping her grandchildren from her out of spite. Gregory had tried to challenge this narrative a few times, but Eleanor would get angry and shut down. He'd given up. He said he knew his wife was wrong, but couldn't force her to see it. He asked if we'd consider letting him visit the kids without Eleanor. Isabel said no. She said allowing him access, while Eleanor was excluded, felt like betraying the boundaries we'd worked hard to establish. Gregory accepted this, but I could hear the pain in his voice. He was losing his grandchildren too, because his wife couldn't admit fault. When Sophie was 4 and Lucas was 2.5, we finally bought a house. 3 bedrooms in a neighborhood with good schools, a small backyard. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. We moved in on a Saturday with help from friends. On Monday evening, someone knocked on our front door. I looked through the window and saw Eleanor standing there. My first thought was to wonder how she'd gotten our new address. Isabel was giving the kids baths upstairs. I opened the door but left the security chain engaged. Eleanor looked older than I remembered. Thinner. Tired. She said she needed to talk to me. I asked how she got our address. She said she'd hired a private investigator. That admission made me furious. She'd spent money having us followed rather than just apologizing. I told her she needed to leave. She said she'd driven 2 hours to get here and just wanted 5 minutes. I said no. She started crying and begging me to let her see her grandchildren. Said she'd missed 2 years of their lives. Said she thought about them every day. Said she was sorry. That last word stopped me. I asked what she was sorry for. She said everything. I asked her to be specific, to list the behaviors she was apologizing for. She hesitated. Then said she was sorry we'd had disagreements. That wasn't good enough. I told her she wasn't sorry for her behavior. She was sorry she was facing consequences. She needed to leave. Eleanor put her hand against the door. She said Sophie and Lucas were her only grandchildren. Said her friends all had relationships with their grandchildren and she had nothing. Said she'd been punished enough. I said she hadn't been punished at all. She'd faced natural consequences for her refusal to respect boundaries. She said she'd respect them now. Said she'd follow whatever rules we set. Said she just wanted to be part of their lives. I asked if she still believed I wasn't good enough for Isabel. She looked down. Said she'd been wrong about that. Said she could see we had a good marriage and a happy family. Said she'd been scared Isabel would struggle financially and wanted better for her. But she could see now that we were fine. I told her I didn't believe her. Told her she was saying what she thought I wanted to hear so she could get what she wanted. She insisted she meant it. I said, if she truly wanted back in our lives, she needed to write a detailed letter acknowledging every specific behavior that had been wrong and explaining what she understood about why it was wrong. She needed to send that letter and then give us time to decide if we believed she'd changed. She asked how much time. I said however long it took. She looked angry for a moment. Then she caught herself and nodded, said she'd write the letter. She left. I watched her drive away and didn't feel hopeful. The letter arrived 3 weeks later, 2 pages handwritten. Eleanor apologized for making comments about my career and income, for buying gifts without permission, for showing up unannounced, for hiring photographers without asking, for lying to the building manager. She said she'd been controlling, and it came from fear of losing her daughter and grandchildren. She said she understood now that her behavior had actually caused what she was trying to prevent. She said she wanted a chance to prove she'd changed. The letter was better than I'd expected. More specific. More self-aware. I showed it to Isabel. She read it twice, and then started crying. She said it was what she'd wanted to hear for 3 years, but she wasn't sure if it was real or if her mother had just gotten better at manipulation. I said we didn't have to decide immediately. We could sit with it and see how we felt. We talked about it for 2 weeks. Discussed whether people could really change or if patterns were too ingrained. Discussed whether depriving Sophie and Lucas of a grandmother was fair to them. Discussed whether we could trust Eleanor to stick to boundaries long-term. Finally, we decided to respond. Isabel called her father and asked him if he thought Eleanor had genuinely changed. Gregory was quiet for a long time. Then he said honestly, he didn't know. Eleanor talked about wanting to see the kids constantly, but she still complained about our boundaries sometimes when she thought he wasn't listening. He said she was trying, but he wasn't sure it was sustainable. We decided to offer 1 supervised visit, 2 hours at a public park with both of us present. Eleanor could meet Lucas properly for the first time since he was born and see how much Sophie had grown. If she followed all boundaries during that visit, we'd consider scheduling another. If she violated any boundary, it would be her last chance. Isabel called her mother and laid out the terms. Eleanor agreed immediately, too immediately, like she'd prepared for this and knew exactly what to say. The visit was set for the following Saturday afternoon. We arrived at the park at 2 p.m. Eleanor and Gregory were already there sitting on a bench. When Eleanor saw Sophie and Lucas, she stood up but didn't rush over. She waited for us to approach. That was good. Following the first boundary. Sophie didn't remember her grandmother. Lucas had never really met her. They hung back, shy and confused. Eleanor introduced herself as Grandma Eleanor and said she'd been away but was so happy to see them now. Sophie asked why she'd been away. Eleanor looked at me. I nodded slightly, giving permission for her to answer. She said she'd made mistakes and needed time to learn to be a better grandma. Sophie seemed to accept this and asked if Eleanor wanted to see her climb the jungle gym. Eleanor said yes. For the next 2 hours, Eleanor followed every boundary. She asked permission before giving Sophie a snack she'd brought. She didn't try to pick up Lucas without checking with us first. She didn't make any comments about our clothes or Lucas's speech development or anything critical. She focused entirely on the kids and asked them questions and played with them. It was the behavior we'd wanted all along. At the end of the visit, Sophie hugged Eleanor goodbye. Lucas waved. Eleanor looked emotional but controlled. She thanked us for the opportunity, said she hoped we could do it again. Isabel said we'd be in touch. We left. In the car, Isabel said that went better than expected. I agreed, but said one good visit didn't mean Eleanor was fixed. Isabel knew. We decided to schedule another visit in 3 weeks. Same conditions. Public place. Both of us present. Eleanor agreed immediately when Isabel called. The second visit went smoothly too. And the third. After 2 months of supervised visits with no incidents, Eleanor asked if she could take Sophie and Lucas to a children's museum for an afternoon. Without us. Isabel looked at me. I said no, not yet. Eleanor looked disappointed but said she understood. We continued supervised visits. 3 months in, Eleanor started to slip. Small comments, asking if we'd considered a different preschool for Sophie because the one she attended wasn't very prestigious. Mentioning that Lucas should be speaking more clearly by now and had we thought about speech therapy. Suggesting we let her buy Sophie a new winter coat because the one she had looked worn. Isabel shut down each comment immediately, told her mother those decisions were ours to make. Eleanor would apologize and change the subject, but the comments kept coming. After the 4th boundary-pushing comment in 2 visits, I told Isabel we needed to address this directly. We called Eleanor and asked her to meet without the kids. She came to a coffee shop near our house. We told her we'd noticed her starting to fall back into old patterns, making unsolicited comments about our choices and offering unwanted advice disguised as concern. Eleanor got defensive, said she was just trying to help, that she had experience raising children and wanted to share what she knew. Isabel said we didn't ask for that help and she needed to stop. Eleanor said she didn't think she was doing anything wrong. I pulled out my phone and read her 3 specific comments from the past month, showed her the pattern. Eleanor went quiet. Then she said, maybe she wasn't ready for this. Maybe she couldn't change enough. Maybe it was better if she just stayed away. Isabel said that wasn't what we wanted. We wanted her to be part of the kids' lives. But she had to truly respect our autonomy as parents. Eleanor started crying, said she was trying so hard, but it was difficult to not share her thoughts. She'd been used to being involved in Isabel's life for so long, and pulling back felt wrong. I said her involvement in Isabel's childhood didn't give her the right to control Isabel's parenting. Eleanor wiped her eyes and nodded, said she'd try harder. The visits continued, but I noticed Eleanor becoming more careful. Too careful. She'd start to say something, then stop herself mid-sentence. She'd look anxious around us. Sophie noticed and asked why Grandma Eleanor seemed sad. I didn't know how to explain it. Gregory called me a month later and asked if we could talk. He said Eleanor was struggling. She felt like she was walking on eggshells and couldn't relax around us. She wanted to be herself, but was scared we'd cut her off again. He asked if there was a path to less supervised visits. I said we were still building trust, and that took time. He said Eleanor might give up if this continued indefinitely. I said that was her choice. We weren't going to rush trust because she was impatient. Gregory said that was fair, but he wanted me to know Eleanor was genuinely trying, and it was taking a toll on her mental health. I felt some sympathy for Eleanor, but more sympathy for Isabel, who'd spent her entire childhood managing her mother's emotions. I told Gregory that Eleanor's mental health wasn't our responsibility. She'd created this situation through years of boundary violations. If she wanted full access to her grandchildren, she needed to prove she could maintain boundaries long-term. Gregory sighed and said he'd tell her. 6 months into supervised visits, I agreed to let Eleanor take Sophie to a movie alone. 2 hours, public place. Eleanor picked Sophie up and I gave her explicit instructions. No buying excessive gifts. No making negative comments about us. No taking Sophie anywhere besides the movie theater. Eleanor agreed to everything. They came back 3 hours later. Sophie was wired on candy and clutching a large stuffed unicorn. Eleanor looked pleased with herself. I asked about the unicorn. Eleanor said it was just a little gift from the theater gift shop. I checked the tag still attached. $45. Not a little gift. I asked Sophie what else happened. She said Grandma Eleanor had taken her to a nice restaurant after the movie and bought her a fancy dress that was in the car. I felt my jaw clench. Isabel asked her mother why she'd violated multiple boundaries in one afternoon. Eleanor said she just wanted Sophie to have special memories with her grandmother. Isabel asked why Eleanor thought it was okay to ignore our explicit instructions. Eleanor said she didn't think it was a big deal, just small treats. I told Eleanor the visits were done. She'd proven she couldn't be trusted. Eleanor panicked and said she'd made a mistake, but it wouldn't happen again. I said she'd said that before. She started crying and begging for another chance. Isabel told her mother to leave. Eleanor left crying. Sophie didn't understand why everyone was upset. She'd had fun with Grandma. Eleanor called Isabel 20 times that night. Isabel didn't answer. The next day, Eleanor showed up at our house crying. I opened the door with the chain still on and told her she needed to leave or I'd call police. She begged through the crack in the door for another chance. Said she'd panicked and tried too hard to make Sophie happy. Said she'd follow every rule from now on. I said we'd given her months of chances, and she'd repeatedly shown she couldn't respect boundaries. She said we were being too harsh, that small mistakes shouldn't result in losing her grandchildren. I said they weren't small mistakes. They were deliberate choices to do what she wanted instead of what we'd asked. She started yelling that we were cruel and unreasonable, that any grandmother would have bought her granddaughter gifts, that we were using the kids as weapons to punish her. I closed the door while she was still yelling. Listened to her bang on it for 5 minutes before leaving. Isabel stood in the hallway holding Lucas and crying. She said she'd really thought her mother had changed. I held them both and said I was sorry. Sorry Eleanor couldn't be the grandmother our kids deserved. Sorry Isabel's mother chose control over relationship. Sorry we had to protect our family from someone who should have protected us. 3 years have passed since that final visit. Sophie is 7 now and doesn't remember Eleanor well. Lucas is 5 and never really knew her. They have Isabel's father Gregory who visits monthly following every boundary we've ever set. He sees his grandchildren without Eleanor and has accepted that's how it has to be. Eleanor sends birthday cards with checks we return unopened. She tried to attend Sophie's kindergarten graduation, but school security removed her after we'd warned them she wasn't welcome. Gregory says she's bitter and angry and still believes she was right. Still believes we're vindictive and cruel. Still believes she deserves access regardless of her behavior. I don't think about Eleanor much anymore except when Sophie asks why she only has one grandma when her friends have 2. I tell her some people can't follow rules and we have to keep our family safe, and she accepts this because children understand boundaries better than Eleanor ever did. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So, subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.